The city of Seattle in Washington state is one of the biggest on the American West Coast. Seattle is historically regarded as one of the most unique and visually stunning cities in the world, and is known for its tech industry, massive forests, and futuristic Space Needle. But did you know that there once existed a different and darker face to the city, completely underground? You see, underneath the streets of Pioneer Square neighborhood lies a hidden section of Seattle, which at one time hosted an array of commerce, both legal and illegal, as well as shops, homes, storage, and a collection of fascinating history unknown to most. This came as the result of Seattle's reconstruction following the Great Fire of 1889. The streets were lifted several stories above ground level, leaving all the surrounding buildings to partially dwell underground. Thus, the Seattle Underground was born. After only a few decades, the city shut down the underground for public health and safety concerns, but some areas remain in use for various nefarious activities, while the rest were left abandoned. Today, we journey into Seattle's underground city. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The city of Seattle, Washington, was founded nearly 170 years ago in 1851, and it originally started out as a community of people looking to get into the timber industry. And many people, including the city's own citizens, are unaware that the neighborhood called Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle is actually the birthplace of this great city. This is also where the Seattle Underground is located. So let's start at the very beginning. Since the founding of the city, Seattle's biggest issue was climate and geography. Seattle is situated right on sea level, and it was built upon a slice of land between the Pacific Ocean and Lake Washington. Modern sewage systems still used today are based on water flow and involve underground pipes, sewers, and toilets, which were once called water closets. These systems, born to the mid-1800s, changed the way that cities worked across the world. However, Seattle, being on sea level and in between two vast bodies of water, would prove to be a huge obstacle for these new systems. The sewage pipes would eventually all filter out to the ocean, but as the high tide would come in, the water would run in the opposite direction and the pipes would overflow, resulting in a very graphic and horrific situation where the reverse flow of the pipes would be so bad that raw sewage would shoot out of people's toilets like a geyser, which obviously was not a pleasant sight for Seattle citizens. Seattle is also a city that experiences constant and heavy rainfall, so as the rain streams down street, this would often lead to the sewage system becoming overwhelmed alongside the water from the high tide. Outside of the sewers, heavy rain would also be a major problem for the city, as it caused severe mudslides in the streets that would be deep enough to swallow people whole. It soon became apparent to city officials that a mass reconstruction of Seattle was required to solve these problems, but that was simply too expensive and challenging to authorize. That was until the Great Fire of 1889, of course. You see, in June of that year, a carpenter's apprentice accidentally let boiling glue come into contact with wood chips, which sparked into a huge fire. And given the fact that Seattle was built almost entirely out of wood, the fire grazed through the city center without stopping for almost 24 hours. A combination of ocean wind fanning the flames in the summer heat along with a dysfunctional fire hydrant system led to the most devastating fire in Seattle's history, seeing 25 blocks completely destroyed along with the entire business district. Though luckily, there were no deaths reported in any official records. In hindsight, many actually viewed the Great Seattle Fire of 1889 as a good thing, since it served as a turning point for the city. Now, Seattle was forced to remodel itself, and with over $120,000 in relief money, they had the funds to do so. This is the environment that led to the creation of the Seattle Underground. The reason that the fire of 1889 was so destructive was that all the buildings were made of wood. So going forward, they required the buildings to be reconstructed of stone or brick, along with new buildings as well. In the midst of all this reconstruction, it was thought that three major problems wood buildings, mud and sewage could be solved at once. As a result, the city officials decided to raise the streets. With these new plans, all the streets in Pioneer Square would be raised 1 story higher, or about 8 feet above ground level. Stone walls would be built on either side of the street, and then the area in between would be filled with new street on top. This way, stone streets as opposed to mud would mean no more mudslides, and now there would also be far more space for bigger and more efficient sewage pipes that could handle the excess water from high tides and rain. However, the project to raise the streets was planned to take nearly a decade to finish, and in the meantime, businesses had to go about their daily commerce as they simply could not wait for 10 years. So as time went by and construction continued, shops, hotels, and restaurants maintained their everyday activities, knowing eventually that the first and sometimes even second floors of their buildings would be entirely underground. Once the new streets were finally finished, the new sidewalks were connected to the old ones through a series of tunnels, staircases, and ladders. However, the staircases and ladders would often be so steep that several deaths were caused when unwary or inebriated pedestrians did not watch where they were walking at night. Seattle would experience great change just prior to the turn of the century, with the 1897 Yukon Gold Rush of Alaska, which saw over 100,000 ambitious miners trek across the United States. In order to reach Alaska, the travelers would have to go through Seattle first before shipping upstream. This brought all kinds of new people and businesses to the city. Many businesses in Pioneer Square capitalized on the gold rush and stocked up on supplies to sell to the incoming miners. So the Seattle Underground was then used as a storage space for all the supplies, but this would end up causing a mass infestation of rats. It was a disturbing sight as there were so many rats in the underground that people would claim the floor looked as if it was moving. The so-called swamp of rats quickly spiraled out of control and started to affect the entire city. It wasn't soon after that Seattle experienced an outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1907 as a result. With this in mind, the city officials formally condemned the underground, beginning a new chapter in its history. After about a decade, the Yukon Gold Rush began to die down. Along with it went the mass influx of travelers to Seattle. Most of the more lucrative legitimate businesses left Pioneer Square to go elsewhere in the city, leaving the once prestigious square to take on a rather negative reputation. You see, the fledgling reputation of Pioneer Square due to the fleeing commerce also coincided with the emergence of the Seattle Underground as a mysterious community, completely separate from those above ground. With the city's condemnation of the underground and the lack of legitimate business in the area, all that remained was the illegal and clandestine enterprises who now had free rein to rule the underground. Then, once the Prohibition era began in the 1920s and alcohol was banned across the United States, the Seattle Underground became a prime location for speakeasies, illegal bars that sold alcohol during Prohibition but were also associated with jazz music, organized crime, flappers, and other popular culture icons of the 1920s. In the underground, many restaurants or bars that were now under the streets were repurposed into these speakeasies that attracted many customers. As we mentioned before, this brought about many safety hazards as numerous intoxicated patrons would fall to their death around the ladders trying to enter or leave the underground. Over time, the Seattle Underground morphed into a topic that was rarely discussed in formal dialogue as it did not officially exist. It soon became a thing of myths, rumors, and tall tales. But by the 1930s, the public intrigue grew large enough that a group of private investors led by a man who called himself Captain G ventured into the underground in 1936. The goal of their journey was the investigation of illegal gambling and racketeering operations which were suspected to be large and lucrative. They would then report their findings in the Seattle Star, a popular newspaper publication for the first first half of the 20th century. Captain G and his investigators concluded that the Seattle Underground was not actually as bad as the public perception of it was. In fact, they noted that it was an entirely different community within itself, and they led a relatively civil society where most adhered to their own laws. Granted, these laws which they obeyed were not the official laws of Seattle, and the people still engaged in numerous illegal activities that the general public viewed as socially degenerate. What the investigators observed was that the Seattle Underground was not necessarily worse than any of the other crime districts within the city or others across the United States. That being said, the criminal operation in the Seattle Underground still posed a huge detriment to the city overall, because all legitimate businesses are heavily taxed by the city government and often have to pay costly license fees. None of the profits from the illegal businesses in the underground ended up in the city's circulation. The underground cost Seattle millions of dollars in lost tax revenue annually. Not only were these illegitimate businesses profitable, but they were also plentiful, as Captain G and his investigators found many bookies, games of blackjack, lotteries, slot machines, and racing spots. However, due to the action of these investigators, who had been granted a plea from a grand jury to look into the underground, lots of the racing spots began to close down. Resorts became deserted, slot machines disappeared, and over time, it seemed the entire illegal industry in the underground faded away. In 1939, the Puget Sound earthquake, which measured as a 6.2 on the Richter scale, shook Seattle, and many parts of the underground were filled with debris, most of which remains there to this day. But other than that earthquake, the Seattle Underground stayed rather undisturbed for the better part of 30 years, ever since the illegal gambling rings were broken up. Well, these series of passageways evolved into sensationalist rumors and myths surrounding the criminal underworld in the 1910s, 1920s, 40s, and 50s. The Seattle Underground almost disappeared completely from the public mind, and everyday citizens would walk the streets without knowing the vast array of corridors that lied just beneath their feet. It wasn't until the 1960s that the underground was rediscovered, when a writer from Pioneer Square named Bill Speidel uncovered old newspapers talking about the old and secretive passageways under the city. After writing about his discoveries and gaining an overwhelming amount of public curiosity, Bill Speidel created the Seattle Underground Tour in 1965 by popular demand. On the tour, customers are taken into the underground itself, where they can experience the mysterious atmosphere firsthand. They also learn the deep history of this unusual structural phenomenon. The tour still exists today and remains very popular, while 20 blocks of Pioneer Square were officially recognized as a historic district by the city. Ever since the creation of the tour, many people claim that the Seattle Underground is a common site for ghost sightings and other forms of paranormal activities. For example, many who take the tour say that they have a constant uneasy feeling throughout, while some have seen and heard unexplained things while taking the tour. There have also been several notes of strange occurrences involving moving objects or changes to pictures or paintings. Some people even notice strange figures in the pictures they take themselves while on the tour. Skeptics would say that this phenomenon is just played up by the tour guides to sell more tickets, but for those with an imagination, it does make sense for the Seattle Underground to be rife with unexplained occurrences given its long and dark history. In fact, the 2021 horror film Malignant, which was directed by famous horror director James Wan, deals with the Seattle Underground in its own storyline. The Seattle Underground remains a strange and very interesting part of Seattle's history. Starting off as a structural solution to sewage problems, mud-covered streets, and landslides, it slowly evolved into the breeding ground for dangerous diseases before hosting the perfect arena for criminal activities such as illegal gambling. Nowadays, the Seattle Underground stands as a shadow of its former self, with the tour serving as a reminder of the deep-lying history that stains its stone walls and wooden ladders. So next time you're walking the streets of Seattle, be wary of the ground you step upon. You never know what might lie beneath it. That's it for today, guys. Hit that subscribe button to catch new videos every Thursday and Saturday. Feel free to put your episode ideas in the comments section below. This is Ryan Socash, signing off.